way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but freed people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
You know, Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, you know? But I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.
Welcome everyone back to the Reparations Task Force Report Marathon Read, Monday through Friday, 8:30 p.m. PST. This is Eman the Mass Media Group, Facts Over Fiction. So today we're going to be concentrating on Chapter 2, the Enslavement. I think we're going to be California focused, possibly. I have not read it, but I think that's where we left off last. So let me go ahead and cue up the beats. Not the meats, but the beats. All right, cool. Got the music jumping off, and let's go ahead and share the screen here so we can get started. All right. All right, here we go. Enslavement in California. Enslavement in California. Slavery's expansion into the West. Even though large numbers of white Northerners profited from labor of enslaved people, many also began to worry about the place of enslavement in the nation's future and to question whether it should be allowed to expand west into new American territories. Some of this new concern sprung from the abolitionist movement, a northern interracial movement of black and white anti-slavery activists who pushed to end enslavement immediately. Across the 1830s and 1850s, American abolitionists pushed thousands of texts and gave thousands of speeches to convince their fellow citizens that enslavement was wrong and against the will of God. They also helped thousands of freedom seekers escape enslavement via a secret network called the Underground Railroad. While most white Northerners disapproved of abolitionism and worried that it would tear the North and South apart, the high-profile nature of the movement and the actions of freedom seekers raised new opposition to enslavement moving west. Most white Northerners' opposition to the westward expansion of enslavement was based on self-interest. They argued that new Western territory should be free soil, so that free white people could have access to inexpensive farmland and opportunities to build wealth without having to compete with wealthy enslavers and enslaved people. Keeping slavery out of the West became a major goal for a growing number of Northerners and put them into conflict with pro-slavery Southerners who wanted enslavement to keep growing westward and to create new enslaving states. The conflict over the westward expansion of enslavement caused bitter political battles and violence in the years leading up to the Civil War. In the 1840s, some Northerners opposed allowing Texas, an independent enslaving nation that had broken off from Mexico, to join the United States. They worried that Texas would add an enormous amount of new territory for enslavement to grow. When the United States declared war on Mexico in 1846 over conflicts related to Texas, many Northerners supported the idea of outlawing enslavement in any new lands that the United States might take away from Mexico. In 1848, the United States did force Mexico to give up a massive territory that included today's states of California, New Mexico, Nevada, and Utah, as well as parts of present-day Arizona, Wyoming, and Colorado. The political crisis grew over whether enslavement should be allowed into these new territories or closed out forever. This crisis intensified when thousands of people rushed to California after the discovery of gold in the state and set up a new state government with a constitution that outlawed enslavement. Northern and Southern politicians in Congress tried to hold the country together by passing a set of laws called the Compromise of 1850. Together, these laws said that California could join the U.S. as a free state and that residents of New Mexico and Utah territories could decide for themselves whether they wanted to allow enslavement. Wow. The Compromise of 1850 also gave other important concessions to both the opponents and defenders of enslavement. It ended the slave trade in Washington, D.C. It also included a harsher fugitive slave law that gave enslavers greater federal aid in chasing down enslaved people who escaped to free states. Limited freedom seekers' ability to defend themselves in court, and harshly punished people who helped freedom seekers for people who refused to participate in enforcing the law. This fugitive slave law further divided white Northerners and white Southerners. Northerners hated the new law for forcing them to participate in enslavement. Southerners viewed Northern opposition to the law as a refusal to enforce the U.S. Constitution. Eventually, this conflict spread all the way to California, where pro-slavery Southerners and anti-slavery Northerners fought over what should happen to enslaved people who escaped their enslavement once they got to the free state. Enslavers and the enslaved in the California Gold Rush. While people in northern and southern states fought over whether enslavement should be allowed to expand west, enslavement already had moved to California. Even though California was supposed to be a free state with anti-slavery constitution, enslavement existed in the state. More importantly, California's early state government protected the constitution of enslavement and greatly limited African Americans' civil rights. The enslavement of African Americans had already started in California before the state adopted an anti-slavery constitution in 1849. California had been part of Mexico before the United States took it in the U.S.-Mexico War of 1846 to 1848. Mexico had already outlawed enslavement in 1829, but American enslavers began trafficking enslaved African Americans into California before, during, and after the U.S.-Mexico War, especially once the gold rush began in 1848. The exact number of enslaved descended people in California is difficult to estimate. Federal and state census records, which counted the number of people in California, show around 203 enslaved African descended people living in the state in 1850 and around 178 in 1852. These are probably undercounts because early census records are very incomplete. These incomplete records, though, do show support for the findings of historian Rudolph Lapp who estimated that at least 500 to 600 enslaved African Americans lived and worked in California during the gold rush. But these numbers may be even higher, because another gold rush source estimated that 1,500 enslaved African Americans lived in California in 1852. Each of these enslaved people suffered traumatic uprooting from their homes and families. Going to California meant a forced separation from family, friends, and community by a distance of thousands of miles. Even though enslavers thought of the move to California as only temporary, most gold seekers spent at least 2 years in California, and usually many more due to the distance and difficulty of traveling between the East and West Coast. For example, an enslaved North Carolina man, known only as John, arrived in California with slaveholder Robert M. Dixon in 1852 and stayed at least 3 years until Dixon suddenly died in 1855. We do not know how long John remained in California or whether he ever returned to North Carolina. His journey to California may have resulted in permanent separation from his family. Like John, more than 75% of the enslaved people trafficked to California were young men or teenage boys who ended up working as gold miners. These enslaved miners faced backbreaking and often dangerous working conditions. Placer minings, the most common type of mining in the earliest days of California gold rush, involved digging up soil from the beds and banks of rivers and creeks. Sometimes miners dammed up the bodies of water to get at soil deep in the beds. These practices often required standing knee or waist deep in cold water for several hours each day in the boiling summer heat. Overwork, exposure to bad weather, unclean working and living environments, a lack of nutritious food, and the absence of medical care often resulted in long-term illness or death by disease. For instance, several enslaved men from western North Carolina died from cholera, a disease caused by contaminated food or water, along with their enslaver in Tuolumne County in 1852. Accidents and injury were also common, as seen in the life of an enslaved man from Kentucky, known as Reuben. He drowned in the American River while working in a mining area in 1851. Rest in peace. Not all enslaved people worked directly in mining. Women and girls, who made up less than 1/4 of all recorded enslaved people in California, often worked as servants, cooks, or laundry workers in private homes, hotels, restaurants, or boarding houses. People with these skills were so scarce and their work so valuable that enslavers often hired out both enslaved women and men as servants. Enslavers then pocketed all or most of the enslaved people's wages from their rented labor. All right, pause for a second. Just need to get a little libation. All right, here we go. Violence against enslaved and resistance to enslavement in California. What's up, darling? Thanks for coming through. Appreciate you. And everybody who is listening and will be listening to the replay here. All right, so let's go. Violence against enslaved and resistance to enslavement in California. Much like enslaved people in the South, those in California also faced brutal violence. In 1850, one slaveholder beat an enslaved man in the town square of San Jose for disobeying him. The police arrested both men, but ultimately determined that the slaveholder was not guilty of assault because his victim was legally his property. In another case from 1850, an elderly enslaved couple ran away near the town of Sonora. When the slaveholder caught them, he whipped the elderly man until his blood flowed so heavily that it filled his shoes. The couples later escaped with the help of a free black neighbor. One of the worst violent events also happened in 1850, this time in Los Angeles. A group of white Southerners chased, shot at, and captured a handful of escaped enslaved people and then beat them until one almost died. The forced journey to California had different outcomes for the enslaved people who survived it. Many people probably worked in California for a few years before returning to enslavement in the South. Others, especially those who were allowed to keep a small portion of their wages from hiring out or digging gold, saved enough money to buy their freedom. Finally, Some enslaved people worked under formal or informal indentured agreements by which they promised to work for a certain number of years in California, or to earn a certain amount of money in exchange for their freedom. Enslaved people who bought their own freedom might then also earn enough money to free their family members. Large members of enslaved people also saw California as a place where they could take their own freedom or challenge their enslavement. The California gold mining country was large, rural, and full of diverse people, including anti-slavery Black and white Northerners. It was much easier to run away, hide, and find allies in California than in southern enslaving states. But it is important to remember that all enslaved people who went west were forced to leave their family members and communities behind in the South. For this reason, escape was not a good option for many enslaved people because staying with enslavers was their only way to keep in touch with their families. In this way, enslavers used their control over enslaved people's family members to force them to cooperate. For this reason, enslaved people may have been more likely to resist in other ways besides running away. For example, some refused to work or escape temporarily until they were allowed to keep more of their earnings. This might have been a safer path to freedom than running away. Running away if they could earn enough money to buy themselves and their family members out of enslavement. California legislature's complicity. California's 1849 anti-slavery state constitution did little to stop the violence and exploitation that enslaved people suffered. The new constitution said that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, unless for punishment of crimes, shall ever be tolerated in the state. The problem with that enslavement already existed in the state and was already being tolerated there. The Constitution also said nothing about what should happen to those enslaved people who already lived in California or those who came after statehood. The California Constitution could say that the state could not tolerate enslavement, but this enslavement did not mean much without laws making it a crime to keep someone enslaved. Laws to free enslaved people, laws to punish enslavers, or laws to protect African Americans' freedom. Pro-slavery white Southerners took advantage of this lack of specific laws against enslavement to keep enslavement going in California. During California's 1849 Constitutional Convention, a meeting to write the state's first constitution, pro-slavery politicians from the South quietly accepted the law banning enslavement. But after statehood, a large number of Southern pro-slavery men ran for political office in California so that they were overrepresented in the state government compared to their overall population in California. White Southerners with pro-slavery views had a great deal of power in the state legislature, the state court system, and among California's representatives in the U.S. Congress. During the 1850s, these men used their political power to make sure that California protected enslavers. They passed and upheld laws that skirted around the anti-slavery Constitution. The California government's most pro-slavery action was passing and enforcing a state fugitive state law in 1852. Pro-slavery Southerners were angry when they discovered that the federal fugitive slave law of 1850, a harsh new law to help slave catchers chase down and re-enslave freedom seekers who escaped enslavement, did not apply to most of cases in California. Enslavers could only use the federal law to chase down and re-enslave people who escaped across state lines, not those who ran away inside one state's borders. In 1852, the California State Legislature dealt with the issue by changing the definition of who counted as a fugitive slave. Instead of just covering people who escaped across state lines, California's new state law said that a fugitive slave was any enslaved person who arrived before California officially became a U.S. state in September 1850, but who refused to return to the enslaving states with their enslavers. These people could be arrested, placed under the control of their enslavers, and forced to return to the South. The legal reasoning behind this law was that California's anti-slavery constitution did not become official until the moment of statehood. Before then, California was a federal territory controlled by the U.S. government. Pro-slavery Southerners believed that the U.S. Constitution gave every white citizen the right to move into the federal territories and to take their property with them, including human beings who were considered property. For this reason, the law supporters argued that the state of California had no choice except to help enslavers capture any enslaved person that they had brought in before official statehood in late 1850. The California legislature's decision to pass the fugitive slave law made California a much more pro-slavery state than most other free states. In the northern U.S., many free states protested the federal fugitive slave law of 1850 and tried to give African Americans more legal rights to defend their freedom against slave catchers. California did the opposite. The California Fugitive Slave Law of 1852 allowed enslavers to use violence to capture enslaved people. All right, so let me just put this one in the chat real quick. All right, let's get back to it. The law also requires state officials to help enslavers capture and arrest enslaved people. Those who refuse to help could lose their jobs and or have to pay expensive fines. Finally, the California Fugitive Slave Law, much like federal fugitive slave law, said that people accused of being fugitive slaves could not testify in court to defend their rights. Since California had already outlawed non-white people from testifying in any court case involving whites, free black Californians who were usually involved in helping people escape from enslavement could not be witnesses in any of these cases either. California's fugitive slave law was supposed to be a temporary one-year policy, but it ended up lasting much longer. In 1853, California legislatures extended the fugitive slave law for another year. They did the same thing again in 1854. This meant that for 3 years, from 1852 to 1855, anyone accused of being a runaway from enslavement could be chased down, dragged before court, and sent back to lifelong enslavement in the South, even if they had been living in the free state of California for 5 years or more. Wow. The California court system's complicity. California courts, including the California Supreme Court, also participated in the enslavement of African Americans. Free black activists, with the help of white lawyers, challenged the legality of the fugitive slave law because it went against the anti-slavery state constitution. They took a test called the Reparations all the way to the California Supreme Court in 1852. The state Supreme Court justices finally decided that 3 black men, Carter Perkins, Robert Perkins, and Sandy Jones, should be forced to go back into enslavement in Mississippi because they had arrived with their enslaver before official statehood. The court said that the anti-slavery law in the California Constitution was only a declaration of a principle. The Constitution said the state would not tolerate enslavement, but California had no laws in place to enforce it by actually setting people free. The justices also agreed with the state legislature that California could not give freedom to enslaved people who arrived before official statehood. The court accepted the extreme pro-slavery legal view that the U.S. Constitution gave enslavers the right to bring enslaved people into the federal territories without any limits. This decision came before the similar one in the much more famous case of Dred Scott versus Sanford 5 years later in 1857. In the historic decision, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the federal government could not outlaw enslavement in any of the federal territories. I'm going to repeat that again. In that historic decision, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the federal government could not outlaw enslavement in any of the federal territories. Altogether, California courts were involved in at least 10 cases connected to the freedom of 13 people under the state fugitive slave law. between 1852 and 1855. In 5 of those 10 cases, the courts returned 7 freedom seekers to enslavement. These numbers may seem small, but this list only includes cases that were well known enough to make it into the newspapers, or for which court records happen to survive. The small numbers also do not accurately show the terror that all African Americans, free or enslaved, would have suffered under this law. When combined with the outlawing of black court testimony against whites, the California Fugitive Slave Law put every black person at risk of being accused of running away, arrested, and enslaved without being able to defend themselves. Finally, the California Fugitive Slave Law was important for symbolic and political reasons. In supporting this law, California's legislature and courts sent an important message. They were friendly to the southern enslaving states. They believed enslaved people should have no legal rights, and they thought that the U.S. Constitution should protect enslavers and enslavement. The California legislature finally let the state fugitive slave law expire in 1855. Still, cases involving freedom seekers from enslavement continued. At least 6 additional cases involving the freedom of 19 people came before the California courts between 1855 and the official end of enslavement in 1865. All of these cases, including the famous 1856 freedom case of Bridget Biddy Mason in Los Angeles County, eventually led to enslaved people's freedom. Shout out to the wonderful and the great Bridget Biddy Mason, Ashe. We actually do briefly cover her in our Reparations Now documentary. And shout out to Tisha Crawford, who gave us a tour of Biddy Mason's. I think we went to her. Yeah, I think they had a memorial of her somewhere down in Los Angeles, if I recall correctly. And Kim and I, we also went by Biddy Mason's cemetery as well to pay respects. So shout out to Biddy Mason for, taking the charge or being in charge. All right, let's get back to it. Let's continue. But one example, the case of Archie Lee from 1857 to 1858, the pro-slavery California Supreme Court made every effort to return him to enslavement. Lee's enslaver, Charles Stovall, forced him to go with him to California years after the state fugitive slave law had expired. But California Supreme Court justices decided that since Stovall was a young man who suffered from constant illness and he did not know about California's laws, he could not be punished by losing his right to own Archie Lee. It took several more lawsuits by free black Californians and a new decision from a federal legal official before Lee finally won permanent freedom. Shout out to Archie Lee. And also the lawsuits by those wonderful and supportive free black Californians. Kind of reminds me of CJ. Anyway, back to the story. California's political leadership and anti-black oppression. During the 1850s, California's political leaders, including governors, state assemblymen, and state senators, supported other anti-black laws. California's 1849 Constitutional Convention restricted the right to vote to white male citizens and also debated, did not pass, an exclusion law to outlaw all future African American migration to the state. Peter Burnett, California's first governor, opposed both enslavement and the presence of African Americans, so he was angry that the new state constitution did not have a black exclusion law. Oh man, yeah, Peter Burnett, this dude. Anyway, let's go back to it, my interjection. Okay, once again, I'm gonna repeat that. This dude was confused. Peter Burnett, California's first governor, opposed both enslavement and the presence of African Americans. So he was angry that the new state constitution did not have a black exclusion law. Man, family, I gotta put this one in the chat. Dang, man, can you just make up your mind? Anyway, crazy. Before coming to California, Burnett had served in Oregon's provisional government and had personally helped pass a black exclusion law. Go figure, interjection. The Lash Law, which said that African Americans who arrived in California would be whipped every 6 months until they left. Wow, shout out to Oregon, which, by the way, I believe it's SB, like, I don't know, 619 or 618, don't quote me. But supposedly they do currently have a reparations bill that is, I don't know if it's inactive right now, but it definitely hasn't passed. So, shout out to Oregon. Hopefully, they do get some restitution and resolution up there for our reparations. But anyway, let's get back to it. Burnett encouraged the California legislature to pass a black exclusion law immediately. He said that failing to exclude black residents would lead to enslavers bringing more enslaved people into the state. When the California legislature failed to pass a black exclusion law in 1850, Burnett gave another speech in 1851 demanding a law to ban black residents. This time, he claimed that any free black residents would be so poor and so upset about not having any civil rights under California law that they would start a race war against whites. Overall, California tried to pass a black exclusion law at least 4 times during the 1850s, but the state legislature was either too politically divided to agree on a law or ran out of time before the legislative session ended. California legislators focused instead on limiting the rights of African Americans who were already in the state. In addition to outlawing African American court testimony in cases involving whites, the California legislature also made interracial marriage between black and white people illegal, excluded African American people from getting homesteads, free or cheap farms on state lands, refused to offer state funding for black children to attend public schools, and would not accept petitions from black activists who wanted to change these unjust laws. After free black activists successfully rescued Archie Lee from enslavement in 1858, angry pro-slavery legislatures tried to make these anti-black laws even worse. They tried to pass another state fugitive slave law and to pass yet another black exclusion law. Although both of these laws failed to pass before the end of the legislative session, the vicious anti-black tone of the state's politics prompted many black Californians to leave the state in search of greater freedom and equality. Starting in 1858, up to 800 African American men, women, and children migrated north to the British colonies of Vancouver Island and British Columbia, in what is now Canada, where many became British subjects. Man, this is crazy. Like, first of all, family, I'm glad y'all are here with me. If y'all haven't, listened to this, or I know Chris, shout out to Chris Lawson, he's doing on Twitter Spaces. If you haven't listened to them, this is an introduction, by the way. If you haven't listened to him, go take a listen to Chris Lawson. You could probably find, I don't know when he's on the CJEC, Twitter Spaces or whatever, but I think he goes sometime. But anyway, if you haven't heard that, and if you haven't read this report, this is very enlightening. I mean, I didn't even know some of this stuff. And it's really a shame that, like, a lot of more people hopefully will be tuning into this, or hopefully be reading the report or listening to it here on in the Mass Media Group, because this is really enlightening stuff. So family, please share this. This is for the community. This is for the American public. And this is for the, California to really know about what happened here in California, especially with this whole anti-blackness that we currently still go through. And this is just deeply embedded, not only in America, but obviously here in California. So let's continue. The U.S. Civil War and the end of enslavement. Political struggles leading up to the U.S. Civil War. Between 1850 and the start of the Civil War in 1861, the political fight over enslavement's westward expansion and African Americans' legal rights became more intense and more violent. Pro-slavery politicians in Congress pushed through the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, a law that overturned the 1820 Missouri Compromise that had outlawed enslavement in most of the Louisiana Purchase lands. This meant that white settlers in the new western territories of Kansas and Nebraska territories could allow enslavement if they wanted to do so. A bloody civil war broke out in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers who had rushed there to claim the new territory for their side. The Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas, as this violence came to be called, shocked many Northerners who opposed enslavement moving into the West. They formed a new political party, the Republican Party, which was based mostly in the North and whose main goal was stopping the westward expansion of enslavement. As Northerners became more anti-slavery, pro-slavery Southerners became more louder in their defense of enslavement. They falsely claimed that enslavement was a gentle and humane institution and that enslaved people got just as many benefits from the institution of white people because they received lifelong care and support in exchange for their work. Interjection, you mean free labor? All right, back. Pro-slavery people also use scientific racism, the false theory that all white people were naturally smarter and more civilized than African descended people, to argue that enslavement was good for people of African descent because it uplifted them. In the late 1850s, the U.S. Supreme Court supported these false theories that African Americans were inferior to white Americans and helped open the Western U.S. to enslavement. In the 1857 case of Dred Scott versus Sanford, the court decided that African Americans were not citizens of the United States and did not have any of the legal rights that white Americans had. Chief Justice Roger Taney from the enslaving state of Maryland explained that white people had always treated black people as slaves and that African Americans were so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. In addition to denying African Americans' claims to legal rights, the court also said that the federal government had no power to close enslavement out of the Western territories. The U.S. Constitution allowed slaveholding Southerners to take their property, including property and human beings, into Western territories. Free African Americans resisted their legal exclusion from U.S. citizenship, both before and after the Dred Scott decision, by claiming birthright citizenship. This was the idea that birth on U.S. soil automatically made them citizens of the United States. Across the first half of the 1800s, African Americans used local courthouses and everyday interactions with state and municipal governments to establish that their U.S. birth entitled them to the title and rights of citizenship. The groundwork laid by free African Americans was eventually the foundation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which made everyone born in the United States a citizen of the United States. Boom. Okay, we're going to do this again. All right, we're going to read this again. We're going to read how our ancestors, right? And, if you're listening to this and you aren't of, Black American descent, you're listening to this too, because this is for everybody. The groundwork laid by free African Americans was eventually the foundation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which made everyone born in the United States a citizen of the United States. So if it wasn't for our ancestors, nobody on this soil right now, including everybody, including immigrants who voluntarily migrate over to this country, receive these benefits from the ancestors who fought for this. All right, as a matter of fact, let's put this in the chat, and then we'll get back to it. All right. All right, family. All right, let's get back to it. The conflict over enslavement's westward expansion and African Americans' rights broke out into a full civil war in 1861. Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, won the presidential election of 1860 by promising to keep enslavement from moving west into any new territories. Pro-slavery Southerners claimed Lincoln's election was proof that all Northerners wanted to end enslavement, give citizenship rights to African Americans, and cause a race war in the South. Less than 2 months after Lincoln's election, South Carolina, an enslaving state, voted to leave the United States. Over the next 2 months, an additional 6 enslaving states, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, also left the United States. They formed the Confederate States of America, also known as the Confederacy. Once war broke out in 1861, another 4 enslaving states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, joined the Confederacy. The deadliest war in U.S. history had begun. The Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. The Confederate States of America, also known as the Confederacy, fought to create a new nation built on the enslavement of people of African descent. The Confederate Constitution was based strongly on the U.S. Constitution, except that it outlawed the national government from ending enslavement. And it said that white people living in any new Confederate territories had the right to own enslaved people. All right, so we'll put that one in the chat too. And this is just crazy. All right, let's get back to it. Alexander Stephens, the Confederate vice president, declared that unlike the United States, the Confederacy was not based on the notion that all men were created equal. Instead, the cornerstone of the Confederacy, the foundation on which it was built, was the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. For many white Southerners in the Confederacy, keeping enslavement was even more important than winning independence from the United States. When the Confederacy lacked soldiers to fight in the later years of the Civil War, Confederate military leaders, including General Robert E. Lee, supported recruiting enslaved men as soldiers. The idea was that enslaved men would fight for the Confederacy in exchange for their freedom. In the end, recruiting enslaved men as soldiers and giving freedom to those who fought for the Confederacy was very unpopular because pro-slavery whites feared that it would weaken enslavement and go against enslaving states' reason for succeeding. For example, Howell Cobb, a Confederate general from Georgia, said that giving guns to the enslaved was a suicidal policy, and the day you make soldiers of them is the beginning of the end of the revolution. Since many white Southerners agreed with Cobb, the Confederacy did not accept the idea of freeing and arming enslaved men as soldiers until March 1865, the last month of the Civil War. The Confederacy organized a handful of enslaved men as soldiers as these very last days of war, but none of them fought in battle. Dude, I need interjection. I don't even know, bruh. Yo bad. Man, this is getting me hyped. All right, calm down. All right, back to it. Unlike the Confederacy, the Union made freeing the enslaved and recruiting enslaved men into the military a major part of its war strategy. Even though Abraham Lincoln and many Republican politicians were not interested in freeing the enslaved at first, the actions of enslaved people pushed the United States toward ending enslavement. Enslaved people began escaping to U.S. military sites even before the war began. When the United States Army began moving into the Confederacy, large numbers of refugees from enslavement, as many as 500,000 people or 12.5% of the entire enslaved population, sought freedom in U.S. Army camps. These freedom seekers worked as wagon drivers, laundry workers, cooks, manual laborers, and nurses for the U.S. Army. However, not all African Americans served in the Army voluntarily, as a small number were kidnapped and forced to enlist against their will. Wow. Congress understood that these freedom seekers would play a key role in winning the war against the Confederacy. Every formerly enslaved person working for the U.S. took away resources from the South and helped the Union. In 1861 and 1862, Congress passed laws called Confiscation Acts, which allowed the U.S. military to give shelter and work to enslaved people who were being forced to work for the Confederacy, and later to any enslaved person whose enslaver supported the Confederacy. Even as the United States was dismantling enslavement, the Union could not immediately or completely abolish the institution. With the secession of 11 southern states, the number of enslaving congressmen decreased accordingly, which did give opportunities of enslavement a political advantage. However, more than 20% of the members of Congress during the Civil War remained either current or former slaveholders, mostly from the border states that had not seceded. Abraham Lincoln was also slow to use the presidential power to free enslaved people. In September 1862, Lincoln wrote a preliminary version of Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all the enslaved people in any area still in rebellion against the United States on the first day of the new year in 1863. Lincoln's preliminary proclamation also recommended transporting newly freed African Americans out of the United States and resettling them elsewhere, a scheme that Lincoln considered seriously for years until it was clear that most African Americans refused to leave the land of their birth. Then on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signed this final Emancipation Proclamation, setting enslaved people free everywhere in the Confederacy, except the parts already controlled by the U.S. Army, and making no reference to removing African Americans overseas. The Emancipation Proclamation also left out the enslaving border states that had not joined the Confederacy, Maryland, Kentucky, Delaware, and Missouri, to keep them loyal to the Union. Enslaved people tear down enslavement and fight for their freedom. Enslaved people set the Emancipation Proclamation in motion by seeking freedom by the thousands, and they also fought for their freedom on the battlefield. Congress stopped excluding black men from the U.S. Army in 1862, and the Emancipation Proclamation opened the way for black men to join the Army and Navy. Free African Americans in Union states quickly organized military units, including the 54th Massachusetts Voluntary Infantry, salute. But most black Civil War soldiers were formerly enslaved men recruited in the South as part of the United States Colored Troops, USCT. Altogether, 178,000 black men served in 175 USCT regiments. Another 29,000 black men served in the U.S. Navy. By the end of the Civil War, black servicemen made up roughly 10% of the entire Union military. They fought in every major Union military campaign between 1864 and 1865 and participated in 39 major battles and 410 smaller armed conflicts. Around 40,000 of these men, around 20% died during the Civil War. Salute, 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 salute. The federal government and the U.S. military did not treat black soldiers equally. Black soldiers faced during hard labor, being fed less nutritious food than white soldiers, and having less access to medical care. The federal government also paid black soldiers less than white soldiers, and black soldiers were closed out of the opportunities to lead their units as high-ranking officers because these positions were given to white men only. Black soldiers' resistance to poor treatment helped fix some of these inequalities after black soldiers protested strongly against lower pay. Congress finally began paying black and white soldiers equally in 1864. By the end of the war, 80 black men also won their promotion to high-ranking officer positions. For a further discussion, the U.S. military discriminatory treatment of African Americans, see Chapter 10, Stolen Labor and Hindered Opportunity. These black servicemen fought bravely to win their freedom, to claim equal rights with white Americans. Satira A. Douglas, a black woman whose husband, H. Douglas, fought in the war, explained that black soldiers wanted to strike the blow that will at once relieve them of Northern prejudice and Southern slavery. They fought courageously because they had everything to gain in this conflict: liberty, honor, social, and political position, and losing the war would result in slavery and prejudice of caste. For instance, the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, the most famous Northern black unit and the one in which Frederick Douglass's two sons served, led a heroic attack on Fort Wagner, South Carolina in July 1863. More than 40% of the men died or were wounded in the attack. One of the survivors of Fort Wagner, Sergeant William Harvey Kearny, eventually was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military honor in the United States, for saving the 54th Massachusetts flag from the enemy. Kearny was among 26 black Civil War soldiers who earned his prestigious medal for bravery above and beyond the call of duty. Salute, 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 salute. Black soldiers also faced more violence on the battlefield than white soldiers. The Confederacy threatened to kill or enslave black soldiers who Confederates captured as prisoners of war. Abraham Lincoln tried to protect black soldiers by warning the Confederacy that the Union would kill or force into hard labor once Confederate prisoners of war for every black soldier that Confederates killed or enslaved. Still, some Confederates targeted black servicemen with violence. In 1864, Confederates attacked a much smaller Union force of mostly black soldiers at Fort Pillow in Tennessee. The Confederates entered the fort and killed 300 men, 200 of whom were black. Witnesses say that Confederates killed these black soldiers instead of capturing them as prisoners of war. After this massacre, it became popular for black soldiers to shout out, "Remember Fort Pillow," as they went into battle to fight for their lives and for their freedom. Salute. The end of the Civil War and the 13th Amendment. The United States won the Civil War against the Confederacy in 1865, effectively ending enslavement in all of the ex-Confederate states. Enslaved people in Texas, one of the very last places reached by the United States Army, did not hear that they had been legally freed until June 19, 1865. This was 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Formerly enslaved black Texans began celebrating June 19th, also known as Juneteenth, a day to remember their hard-fought battle for freedom. 6 months later, on December 6, 1865, the required number of states finally approved the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, outlawing enslavement and making emancipation permanent. The amendment said that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Section 2 of the 13th Amendment also empowered Congress to pass appropriate legislation to enforce the elimination of enslavement, which the U.S. Supreme Court later interpreted as the power to outlaw all badges and incidences of slavery. All right, so let's see how long we have left to go. Okay. All right, family. So we're going to see if we can hopefully wrap it up by 10. So thanks, everyone, for your patience. And here we go. Let's do it. Reconstruction and the lost cause. Reconstruction begins. After the end of the Civil War and the outlawing of enslavement, the United States went through a process known as Reconstruction, a period of rebuilding and reuniting the country. Abraham Lincoln had begun this process during the Civil War, but Lincoln's assassination in April 1865 put Reconstruction in the hands of his Vice President, Andrew Johnson, and Republicans in Congress. President Johnson was a former Democrat from Tennessee who remained loyal to the Union. He disapproved of the Confederacy and wanted to punish wealthy enslavers who participated in it. But he also wanted to keep white people in charge of the South and opposed giving equal political rights to African Americans. Okay, that interjection, that just sounds really hypocritical, but anyway, back to it. As Johnson wrote in an 1868 letter to the governor of Missouri, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be government for white men." All right, so yeah, some more evidence. All right, let's put this in this sucker. Johnson fought with Republicans in Congress over the direction of Reconstruction and African American civil rights, which eventually led to Johnson's impeachment. Congressional Republicans took over the process of Reconstruction and passed new laws aimed at giving formerly enslaved people basic legal rights. Congressional Republicans in several overlapping goals, regrowing the Southern cotton economy, Republicans had several overlapping goals, regrowing the Southern cotton economy, rebuilding the ex-Confederate states' governments before allowing them to come back fully into the United States, and making sure that formerly enslaved people could no longer be held in enslavement. Some of the most progressive Republicans, known as radical Republicans, wanted to completely change social, economic, and political life in the South to support Black equality. But moderate and conservative Republicans mostly focused on laws that would give African Americans basic legal and economic rights, such as making contracts to work and getting paid for their work. Formerly enslaved and former enslavers in the South had their own goals. Formerly enslaved people wanted more than just basic legal rights. They wanted to be independent, out of the control of their former enslavers, and to own small farms where they could work for themselves. They wanted to educate themselves and their children. They wanted the ability to move around in search of family members sold away during enslavement. Finally, they wanted political rights such as the right to vote and hold office. Former enslavers refused to acknowledge African Americans' new freedom. In every ex-Confederate state, white Southerners passed laws called Black Codes. Black Codes included vagrancy laws that allowed police to arrest any Black person without an employer and force them to work. Black codes in some states also forced Black parents to give control over their children to their former enslavers. State courts generally punish African Americans more harshly than white Americans charged with the same crimes. Republicans in Congress would have to force former enslavers in the South to treat the formerly enslaved fairly equally and with basic human dignity. Republicans briefly considered passing laws that would take away land from wealthy Confederates and give it to formerly enslaved people so that they could support themselves as independent farmers. Immediately before the end of the Civil War, Congress created the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands to provide for the welfare of formerly enslaved African Americans, including through issues of provisions, clothing, and fuel as necessary for the immediate and temporary shelter and supply of destitute and suffering refugees and freedmen and their wives and children. According to the statute, commonly known as the Freedmen's Bureau, the agency had the authority to supervise labor relations in the South, with the mandate to provide education, medical care, and legal protections for formerly enslaved African Americans, along with authority to rent out and eventually sell allotments of abandoned or confiscated land to free African Americans. All right, interjection. I think This needs to be resurrected, the Freedmen's Bureau, especially down, well, all across the country, but especially down in the South, in Mississippi. I mean, wow. Anyway, let's get back to it. The original goal of the Freedmen's Bureau Act was the more radical notion of allowing African Americans the means to become self-sufficient. In the closing days of the Civil War, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman issued Special Order Number 15, setting aside 400,000 acres of confiscated land for those who had been freed, and 2 months later, the Freedmen's Bureau Act formalized the field order, providing that each Negro might have 40 acres at a low price on long credit. All right, so we're going to put that in there. I know most people who are listening to this probably are familiar with Special Field Order Number 15, but if you're not, definitely go look further into it. All right, let's see. All right, cool. Let's get back to it. All right, many free African Americans and Northern Republicans believe that land reform in the South, granting formerly enslaved African Americans access to their own land, was a true way that formerly enslaved people could be free from their enslavers. The resulting independent black farmers would provide a power base for a new social and political order in the post-war South. Okay, interjection. I'm sorry, I just got to mention that. I mean, it's just crazy just to think, how many of us right now have mortgages. I mean, when our ancestors, if we own these lands, it's like outright. I'm not saying that eventually we may or may not have mortgages, but I mean, most likely we probably wouldn't even have mortgages these days because we were to own our own land outright, right? Anyway, I don't know. Just a thought. All right, back to it. The new vision of social relations in the South was opposed by white Southerners as well as Northerners who opposed enslavement but did not believe in full equality for African Americans. Most white Americans, even in the North, thought that these policies were too radical because they took away ex-Confederates' individual property rights and set a dangerous precedent that wealth could be redistributed to poor members of society. Okay, we got to put this one in there because this is like some serious information, family. Like, I mean, this is crazy. All right. Moreover, a large number of black landowners would threaten plantations and disrupt the Southern economy and social system. White capitalists in the North and South believed that black freedom should mean black workers continuing to work on a plantation, although they would now be paid. They did not believe that African Americans should be able to support themselves independently through subsistence farming, which would have led to less cotton being grown and posed a threat to the interests of cotton merchants and other capitalists in the South, elsewhere in the United States and in Europe. In less than a full harvest season, the land that Sherman had given to freed persons was returned to their prior owners. Although the Freedmen's Bureau tried to assert and protect the rights of the formerly enslaved, it also perpetrated racist stereotypes, paternalistic attitudes, and continued to limit African Americans' economic and social power. Bureau agents often viewed formerly enslaved African Americans as children, unprepared for freedom and needing to be taught the importance of work and wages. The Freedmen's Bureau abandoned the possibility of land reform in the South and focused mostly on labor relations between black and white Southerners instead. Republicans' other major Reconstruction policies focused on making sure that formerly enslaved black Southerners had access to basic civil rights such as rights to make contracts, own property, keep their families together, have physical safety, and be treated fairly by the courts and the criminal justice system. In 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act that made anyone born in the United States a citizen, without regard to their race, color, or previous enslavement. Newly freed black citizens were supposed to have the same equality under the law as it enjoyed by white citizens. Republicans feared that a federal law like the Civil Rights Act of 1866 could be overturned easily if another political party came into power. They pushed for a constitutional amendment that would make black citizenship and civil rights permanent. The 14th Amendment, approved by Congress in 1866 and ratified by the required number of states in 1868, said that any person born in the United States was a citizen, birthright citizenship. That state governments could not take away the life, liberty, or property of any person, citizen or non-citizen, without due process of law, following standard legal procedures, and that the states had to treat every person equally under the law. Black activists had finally won their decades-long battle for birthright citizenship, and all people born in the United States now benefited from their work. Read that again. Black activists had finally won their decades-long battle for birthright citizenship, and all people born in the United States now benefited from their work. All right, let's get back to it. Congress soon decided that formerly enslaved people's legal and economic rights could not be protected unless African Americans had political rights, specifically rights to vote and hold office. The 15th Amendment, approved by Congress in 1865 and ratified by the required number of states in 1870, made it illegal for states to discriminate against voters based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The intention was to stop the states from denying voting rights to African American men. As with the 13th and 14th Amendments, the 15th Amendment gave Congress the power to pass future legislation to ensure that the states follow the law. California rejects restriction civil rights legislation. The legislature and governor of California strongly opposed Congress's Reconstruction civil rights laws and tried to stop them. During the Civil War, black Californians had fought for and won new rights, such as the right to testify in court cases involving whites. This was because white Republicans controlled the legislature and governorship during the early 1860s and took power away from the pro-slavery Democrats who used to control the state. But many white Californians opposed congressional civil rights laws to protect formerly enslaved people and worried that these laws would apply to other non-white people in the state. Democrats came back into power in California in 1867 by promising white voters that they would fight against Reconstruction and any new law that would make African Americans, Native Americans, or Chinese Americans equal to whites or give them voting rights. This is crazy. Man, what is up? All right, let's go. Change the track a little bit. Get a little something. All right, here we go. California Democrats who controlled the state legislature kept this promise when it came to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendments. California legislature ignored the 14th Amendment and never considered it. The legislature voted to reject ratifying the 15th Amendment in 1870. Enough other states had ratified the amendments that they became part of the U.S. Constitution without California's approval. Still, California would continue its resistance to Reconstruction civil rights legislation by refusing to ratify the 14th Amendment until 1959, and the 15th Amendment until 1962. California also led the way in establishing the legal defense for segregation during Reconstruction. In 1874, the Supreme Court of California made a destructive decision that the rest of the United States eventually followed. In the case of Ward versus Flood, California Supreme Court justices decided that segregation in the state's public schools did not violate the 14th Amendment as long as black children and white children had equal access to similar schools and educational opportunities. 22 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court made a similar, separate but equal decision in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. This decision supported the segregation of public facilities in the United States for almost 60 years. The destruction of Reconstruction. All right, fam, let's see. The destruction of Reconstruction. African Americans fought for and took advantage of many new legal rights during Reconstruction, but this time period of growing legal equality was short. White supremacist terrorist groups, first the Ku Klux Klan and then later militias such as the White League of Louisiana and the Red Shirts of South Carolina, eventually overthrew the Reconstruction governments that Black and white Republicans had established together in the South. For a detailed discussion of African Americans' political accomplishments during Reconstruction and white supremacist terrorism in the U.S. South, see chapters 3, Racial Terror, and 4, Political Disenfranchisement of this report. All right. White Southern Democrats who wanted to keep African Americans working on plantations and out of politics retook control of the southern states. The long and expensive process of Reconstruction lost popularity with white Northerners, and many of them wanted to give up on the project of trying to change the racial, legal, and economic relationships of the South. During the U.S. presidential election of 1876, white Northern Republicans abandoned Reconstruction in the South in exchange for keeping control of the presidency of the United States. After the election, Ohio Republican Rutherford B. Haynes and New York Democrat Samuel Tilden both claimed to be the winner. It was well known that white Southerners had used violence, threats, and fraud to keep African Americans from voting for the Republican Hayes. The national leadership of the Republican and Democratic parties made a secret deal. In exchange for Democrats acknowledging Hayes' victory in the presidential election, Republicans would reduce federal support for Reconstruction. Soon after Hayes became president in 1877, he pulled U.S. troops out of key areas in the South where they had been protecting African Americans, political rights, and Republican office holders. Hayes' action effectively ended direct federal protection of African Americans' political rights in the South. The U.S. Supreme Court played its own important role in defeating Reconstruction. In the 1870s, the court made several decisions that greatly reduced the power of the 14th Amendment and federal laws to protect Black equality. Okay. I'll paste that in there. Shout out to the Supreme Court. The last of these decisions happened in the 1883 civil rights cases, a group of several cases that African Americans had brought under the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1875. That act had made it illegal for theaters, hotels, and public transportation companies, such as railroads, to exclude African Americans. Didn't seem to help out that much, interjection. Anyway. The Supreme Court decided in 1883 that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was unconstitutional because the Fourth Amendment, on which it was based, only gave Congress the power to stop state governments from discriminating against African Americans. Congress could not outlaw individual people and private business owners from discriminating against African Americans. Only the state governments themselves could do that. The Supreme Court decision in the civil rights cases legalized racial discrimination and segregation in most public places. It set the stage for the separate but equal decision in Plessy versus Ferguson 1896 and practices such as housing discrimination and education segregation. All right. The rise of the lost cause. After Reconstruction ended, white Southerners created the myth of the Confederate lost cause in order to downplay the horrors of enslavement and terrorize African Americans. Southerners who opposed Black civil rights falsely argued that Civil War had little to do with enslavement. Here we go. The Lost Cause myth claims that the Confederacy have fought a heroic war to save the Southern way of life from being destroyed by the North. This untruthful history also claims the Confederacy lost the Civil War only because the more populated, industrialized North overpowered white Southerners, not because enslavement or the Confederate cause was wrong. All right, quick interjection. If people haven't seen Birth of a Nation, I think his director's name was DeMille or something like that. I believe it was released in 1915, I think it was. Definitely you should check out that movie. It should be somewhere online somewhere, but that movie definitely had its 2 cents in resurrecting the Ku Klux Klan. All right, back to it. The Lost Cause is not just a story that white Southerners tell. It is a weapon of terror against African Americans and a rejection of the Southern defeat in the Civil War and Black civil rights. At the end of the 1800s and the start of the 1900s, white Southerners began building thousands of monuments and statues all over the South to celebrate famous Confederates and to name important buildings after Confederate figures. In the 1910s, the Ku Klux Klan, which the federal government had broken up during Reconstruction, reemerged and began terrorizing and murdering African Americans. The combination of violence against African Americans and the constant sight of monuments celebrating the enslaving Confederacy were terrorist tactics meant to silence African Americans and keep them from challenging white supremacy. Lost cause symbols became especially important to white Southerners who tried to stop the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. White Southerners who opposed African American civil and human rights beat and murdered Black and some white civil rights activists. They also began regularly flying versions of the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederate Stars and Bars, popularly known as the Confederate flag, to threaten civil rights activists and to show that they were determined not to give equality to African Americans. Even though defenders of the Lost Cause have argued that Confederate monuments and flags stand for heritage, not hate, and they claim that removing them erases history, this argument ignores the true history of these objects. White Southerners have used them strategically as symbols of terror to try and keep African Americans from fighting for full equality. California and the Lost Cause. In California, white Americans popularized the Lost Cause mythology with national audiences. The Hollywood film industry was responsible for bringing the Lost Cause to movie screens and making it popular with many white Americans, North and South, during the first half of the 1900s. Okay, I said DeMille, my bad, but looks like I was right about the year, family. Boom. All right. W.D. Griffith's blockbuster film, The Birth of a Nation, in 1915, falsely showed members of the Ku Klux Klan as heroes who were protecting white women and Southern honor against violent African Americans, mostly played by white actors who painted their faces black. This film was the main factor behind the revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1900s. Gone with the Wind, 1939, celebrated the pre-Civil War South by showing a world of kindly enslavers, loyal and happy enslaved people, and heroic Confederates fighting for the Southern way of life. White Californians also built Confederate monuments across the state. For example, a plaque honoring a Confederate President Jefferson Davis, set up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, stood along a Bakersfield, California highway for almost 80 years. Wow. A monument in the Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles, California, built in 1925, celebrated all Confederates who died on the Pacific coast. Although both of the monuments have now been removed, their existence reminds us of California's complicity in the United States' long history of enslavement, white supremacist terrorism, and systemic racism against African Americans. Conclusion. In order to steal and profit from the labor of millions of human beings for 244 years, the colonial American and U.S. governments built an institution of enslavement that was markedly different from the type of slavery that the world had seen before. Americans passed laws that enshrined a racial hierarchy with white people at the top and black people at the bottom. This hierarchy was based on the false idea that all white people were naturally superior in intelligence and morality to all black people. And white Americans then used these ideas to justify the lifelong enslavement of people of African ancestry and their descendants. American law enslaved babies from the moment they were born, through childhood until the moment they died, and ensured that all their descendants suffered the same fate. During certain time periods, state governments even passed laws that made it illegal for enslavers to voluntarily free enslaved people from their bondage. Enslavement was a badge pinned on people of African descent because of color of their skin. When slavery formally ended in 1865, this racial hierarchy continued functioning. The end of Reconstruction and the rise of the lost cause brought a long period of political, social, economic, and legal inequality for African Americans that white people enforced through terrorism, violence, and exploiting legal loopholes. This period was known as Jim Crow, after a racist stereotype character popular with white Americans, and lasted roughly 60-70 years from the 1890s to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Without the laws that made enslavement legal, American citizens aided by government officials terrorized, murdered, and abused their black neighbors to maintain this legacy of slavery, as discussed in Chapter 3, Racial Terror. During this period, white Southerners gradually took discrimination in law enforcement, judicial decisions, and prison sentencing that doomed African Americans to slavery-like conditions, as discussed in Chapter 11, an unjust legal system. Government actions relegated African Americans to mostly urban neighborhoods with underfunded schools, as discussed in Chapter 6, separate and unequal education, and menial and service jobs. U.S. Supreme Court decisions such as the civil rights cases 1883 and Plessy v. Ferguson 1896 excluded African Americans from using public facilities such as schools on equal terms with white Americans, and validated discrimination in housing that excluded African Americans from desirable neighborhoods. These legal decisions and violent practices caused direct physical harm to African Americans by segregating them in polluted, unhealthy neighborhoods, as discussed in Chapter 7. Racism in environment and infrastructure, and denying them equal access to equality health care, as discussed in Chapter 12. Mental and physical harm and neglect. Let's see here. Okay. The racial hierarchy that laws created during enslavement also created deeply harmful and untrue racial stereotypes, which have followed African Americans throughout American history, as discussed in Chapter 9. Control over spiritual, creative, and cultural life, inequalities in the criminal justice system, child welfare laws, housing, and healthcare harmed several black families, as discussed in Chapter 8. Pathologizing the black family, while discriminatory, predatory banking practices and employment discrimination prevented many African Americans from accumulating generational wealth to pass down to the children, as discussed in Chapter 13, the wealth gap. 400 years of discrimination has resulted in an enormous and persistent wealth gap between black and white Americans, as discussed in Chapter 13, the wealth gap, and continuous and compounding harm on the health of African Americans, as discussed in Chapter 12, mental and physical harm and neglect. As the following chapters will show, these effects of slavery continue to be embedded in American society today and have never been sufficiently remedied. The governments of the United States and the state of California have never apologized to or compensated African Americans for these harms. I'm just going to read this paragraph. I think I forgot it, so I'm just going to read it just so it's on record here. Let's see. During this period, white Southerners gradually took away black Southerners' rights to vote by using violent intimidation against and legal loopholes such as literacy tests and poll taxes to disqualify Black voters, as discussed in Chapter 4, Political Disenfranchisement. As Black people fled violence and oppression in the rural South to find economic opportunity in the North and the West, government officials maintained the racial hierarchy by putting up barriers to prevent Black and white Americans from living in the same neighborhoods, as discussed in Chapter 5. Housing segregation and allowing private companies to prevent Black and white Americans from holding the same jobs, as discussed in Chapter 10. Stolen labor and hindered opportunity. New systems of forced labor such as convict leasing, sharecropping, and debt peonage kept formerly enslaved African Americans working for white Americans on cotton plantations or in other industries, as discussed in Chapter 10. Much of this forced labor rested on discrimination in law enforcement, judicial decisions, and prison sentencing that doomed African Americans to slavery-like conditions, as discussed in Chapter 11, An Unjust Legal System. All right. Actually, I read the following chapters. Oh, I'm sorry, not the chapters, paragraphs. So it looks like that is it, family. Let's see. It's gonna go down. Yeah, I think that is it. Yep, some endnotes. Okay, so Chapter 3 is racial terror. So thanks everyone for coming. Really appreciate you. Spread the word. If you have time to read this and take some notes, or come back, listen to the audio, take notes, get yourself prepared any means you can mentally to help you start preparing for these reparations, because we gonna get them, family. Like, this is coming. Like, we're owed this. All right. So we should be back tomorrow around 8:30 to read this chapter, Chapter 3, Racial Terror. I don't know if we're gonna do a part 1 and part 2. I gotta look back to see how many pages it's gonna be. Usually I try to get us out of here by 10 o'clock. I don't want to push us past 10 because I know we all need our rest so we can get up the next day and go fight for these reparations. All right, family. On that note, you guys take care of yourself. Be safe. Love your family. Love life. And love this whole thing. All right, family. Yeah, appreciate you, Darlene. Always appreciate you, sister. All right, family, we out. Y'all have a good one, and see y'all tomorrow. Love, peace, and reparations.
The way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but free people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have Black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total Black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, you know? But I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I gotta show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.